Vexthul had always considered himself the pinnacle of evolutionary perfection, standing 9 feet tall with crystalline armor that could deflect plasma bolts and claws that could slice through titanium like butter. He was what his species called a true apex predator. So when his reconnaissance ship decided to take an unscheduled dive into the atmosphere of some backwater planet called Earth, he wasn't particularly concerned. After crawling out of the smoking wreckage, Vexthul surveyed his surroundings with the kind of casual arrogance that comes from being at the top of the food chain for 3,000 years. Trees, grass, some primitive stone formations, and, according to his scanner, an abundance of soft, squishy lifeforms just begging to be dominated. The locals called themselves humans, apparently, and from what his species database indicated, they were barely more advanced than the average cave-dwelling rodent. Perfect. A little sport before the rescue beacon brought his extraction team. The first human he encountered was wandering through what appeared to be some kind of nature preserve, wearing the most ridiculous combination of brown fabric and a wide-brimmed hat that Vexthul had ever seen. The creature was roughly half his height, completely lacking in natural armor, and possessed no visible weapons whatsoever. This was going to be embarrassingly easy. Vexthul stepped out from behind a tree, his crystalline form catching the sunlight and throwing prismatic rainbows across the forest floor. He extended his claws, which hummed with barely contained energy, and let out his species' traditional war cry, a sound that had sent entire battalions of heavily armed soldiers fleeing in terror across 17 different star systems. The human looked up from whatever he was doing, glanced at Vexthul, and said, "Oh, hey there, buddy. You lost, or something?" Vexthul blinked. That was definitely not the response he was expecting. Where was the screaming, the running, the inevitable begging for mercy that never came? "I am Vexthul of the Crystari Empire," he announced in his most intimidating voice, the one that literally translated as Deathbringer of Infinite Suffering in most galactic languages. "Your world is now under my dominion. Kneel before your new master, primitive creature." The human, who was apparently examining some kind of plant, barely glanced up again. "Yeah, that's nice. Listen, you're standing right next to some poison ivy there, and I'm guessing your species doesn't have the best relationship with Earth botanicals. Might want to take a step to your left." Vexthul looked down. He was indeed standing next to a cluster of 3-leaved plants that his scanner was now helpfully identifying as Toxicodendron radicans, moderate skin irritant for carbon-based life forms. This was not going according to plan. "Did you hear what I said, flesh creature?" Vexthul tried again, adding a bit more menace to his tone. "I am an apex predator, the ultimate life form, your species' new ruler." The human finally stood up and extended a hand. "Jake Thompson, Park Ranger. Nice to meet you, Vex. Mind if I call you Vex?" Vexthul's a bit of a mouthful. Vexthul stared at the outstretched appendage, completely baffled. In his 3 centuries of conquest, no one had ever tried to shake hands with him before. Deciding that subtlety was clearly wasted on this particular species, Vexthul took a step back and decided to demonstrate exactly why the Crystari were the galaxy's most feared predators. His crystalline armor began to glow, internal energy building to dangerous levels, and with a dramatic flourish that had terrified countless civilizations, he unleashed a torrent of superheated plasma from his claws. The trees around him instantly burst into flames, the ground beneath his feet turned to glass, the very air shimmered with heat that could melt steel. It was, by any reasonable measure, an absolutely spectacular display of raw, destructive power. Jake looked at the inferno, nodded approvingly, and said, "Well, that's one way to start a campfire." Then the human reached into one of his many pockets, pulled out a small rectangular device, and with a casual flick of his thumb, produced a tiny flame. "Course, most of us just use these nowadays." Vexthul stared at the lighter. "What sorcery is this?" "It's called a Bic, Vex. Costs about $1.50 at any gas station." Jake wandered over to a nearby clearing, apparently completely unbothered by the fact that he was standing next to an alien who had just demonstrated the ability to incinerate small forests. "Here, let me show you how we usually do the fire thing." What followed was perhaps the most humiliating education in Vexthul's entire existence. Jake began gathering small twigs and dry leaves, explaining his process with the patient tone of someone teaching a particularly slow child. "See, the trick isn't making the biggest fire possible. Any idiot can do that. The trick is making the right fire for what you need." Within minutes, Jake had constructed what he called a proper campfire. Not the raging inferno of destruction that Vexthul had created, but a neat, controlled flame that somehow seemed far more impressive in its deliberate simplicity. "Now watch this," Jake said, pulling out what appeared to be some kind of white cylindrical food item on a stick. "We call these marshmallows. They're 90% sugar and absolutely terrible for you, but when you toast them over a fire like this... He held the marshmallow over the flames, rotating it carefully until it turned a perfect golden brown. Vexthul watched in fascination as Jake demonstrated the precise temperature control needed to achieve optimal marshmallow consistency. His own plasma fire, meanwhile, had burned itself out after consuming everything combustible within a 30-foot radius. "Your fire lasted longer," Vexthul observed, somewhat grudgingly. "Well, yeah," Jake replied, offering him the toasted marshmallow. "That's because I didn't try to show off. Fire's a tool, not a weapon, though it can be both if you're not careful." He gestured toward a nearby sign that read, "SM Moki Bear says, only you can prevent forest fires." We learned that lesson the hard way a few times. Vexthul tentatively accepted the marshmallow, which dissolved into sugary sweetness the moment it touched his tongue. It was possibly the most delicious thing he'd ever tasted, which was deeply troubling for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. "I don't understand," he said finally. "My species has harnessed the power of stellar cores. We can create temperatures that would make your sun jealous. How is your primitive combustion superior?" Jake poked at the campfire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks dancing into the evening air. "Because we didn't just learn how to make fire, Vex. We learned how to live with it. There's a difference between power and control. Your fire burns everything and then dies out. Ours burns just what we want, for as long as we need it to." He pulled another marshmallow from his pack. "Plus, let's be honest here. When's the last time your plasma claws made s'mores?" Vexthul had no idea what s'mores were, but he was beginning to suspect he was about to find out. And more troublingly, he was beginning to look forward to it. The next morning, Vexthul decided to regain some dignity by demonstrating his species' mastery over matter itself. Surely these primitive humans would be impressed by advanced crystalline technology that could manipulate molecular structures at will. He found Jake by a small creek, staring thoughtfully at the water flowing between the banks. "Behold, human," Vexthul announced, his armor beginning to shimmer with power. "I shall show you what true engineering looks like." With a series of complex gestures that had taken him decades to master, Vexthul began restructuring the silicon in the nearby rocks. His crystalline implants interfaced with the mineral structure, breaking down atomic bonds and rebuilding them according to his will. Within minutes, he had constructed an elaborate bridge across the creek, a sweeping arch of perfectly smooth crystal that sparkled like a rainbow in the morning sun. It was, objectively speaking, a masterpiece of alien engineering. The bridge could have supported a starship and would last for millennia without maintenance. Jake looked at it for a moment, then said, "Huh, that's pretty, but it seems like a lot of work for a creek that's only 3 feet wide." Then the human wandered upstream, picked up a large flat stone and dropped it into the water with a splash. He added another stone next to it, then another until he had a series of stepping stones leading across the creek. "There we go," Jake said, hopping across on the stones with practiced ease. "Gets you to the other side just the same, and I didn't have to, restructure reality or anything." Vexthul stared at the stepping stones. "But my bridge is clearly superior. It's stronger, more durable, more aesthetically pleasing." "Sure is," Jake agreed. "How long did it take you to build?" "Approximately 17 minutes of focused molecular manipulation." "Right. Took me about 30 seconds to drop some rocks in the water." Jake hopped back across his stone bridge, then looked thoughtfully at Vexthul's crystal masterpiece. "Plus, what happens when someone else needs to cross a different creek? People would need to find someone with my particular abilities to construct another bridge." "Or," Jake said, gesturing to the abundant rocks scattered along the creek bed, "they could just drop some rocks in the water." This was not going the way Vexthul had planned. "But surely you can see that my method is more advanced." "Oh, it's definitely more complicated," Jake said. "Not sure that's the same thing as advanced, though. See, the thing about rocks is that they're everywhere. Your crystal bridge thing? That's amazing, don't get me wrong, but what happens if you're not around? What happens if your power runs out? What happens if you meet a creek on a planet that doesn't have the right minerals?" As if summoned by some cosmic sense of irony, Vexthul's crystal bridge chose that moment to begin flickering. His energy reserves, depleted from yesterday's fire display and this morning's molecular manipulation, were running low. The beautiful arch began to destabilize, wavering like a heat mirage. Whereas rocks, Jake continued cheerfully, apparently oblivious to the fact that several tons of unstable crystal were currently hovering over the water. Rocks are pretty much the same everywhere. Gravity works the same everywhere, and any idiot with opposable thumbs can stack them up. With a sound like breaking glass, Vexthul's bridge collapsed into the creek, with a tremendous splash. Jake's stepping stones remained exactly where he'd placed them. The funny thing about simple solutions, Jake said, shaking water droplets off his hat, is that they tend to keep working even when everything else goes sideways. Vexthul stared at the wreckage of his technological marvel, then at the humble pile of rocks that had somehow outlasted his finest engineering. For the first time in his life, he was beginning to wonder if his species' definition of primitive might need some revision. By the third day, Vexthul's worldview was hanging by a thread thinner than quantum mesh. But he had one more card to play, one area where surely his predatory supremacy would be unquestionable. He was, after all, designed by evolution to hunt and kill. These soft humans had no natural weapons, no armor, no claws or fangs or acid spit. When it came to dealing with dangerous wildlife, there was simply no way they could compete with a true apex predator. That's when he heard the growling. Deep, rumbling, and unmistakably hostile, the sound came from the underbrush about 50 yards from where Jake was examining some kind of flowering plant. Vexthul's predator instincts kicked in immediately. His crystalline armor began to hum with defensive energy, his claws extended and every sense sharpened to combat readiness. "Human Jake," he called out in what he considered his most authoritative voice. "There is a dangerous predator approaching. Stand back and witness how a true apex hunter handles such threats." Jake looked up from his flowers, glanced toward the growling, and called out, "Buster, cut it out. You're scaring my new friend." The growling stopped immediately. What emerged from the bushes was not the slavering beast of death that Vexthul had been preparing to battle, but rather the most ridiculous-looking creature he'd ever encountered. It was covered in golden fur, had a tail that wagged so enthusiastically it seemed to power the entire animal, and a tongue that hung out at an angle that suggested either severe neurological damage or complete and utter happiness. "Vex, meet Buster," Jake said casually. "Buster, meet Vex. He's from space." The creature, Buster, apparently bounded over to Vexthul with the kind of fearless enthusiasm that suggested either incredible bravery or complete stupidity. It began sniffing at his crystalline legs with obvious interest. "This is your dangerous predator?" Vexthul asked, genuinely confused. "Oh, no, Buster's not dangerous. Well, not unless you count his breath after he's been eating garbage. He's a golden retriever, bred specifically to be friendly, loyal, and absolutely useless in any kind of fight." Vexthul stared down at Buster, who had now decided that the alien's feet were the most fascinating thing in the universe. "But the growling—" "Yeah, he does that when he's excited about meeting new people. It's his way of announcing himself. Watch this." Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a small rubber ball. "Buster, sit." Buster's entire demeanor changed instantly. The goofy expression vanished, replaced by laser-focused attention. His hindquarters hit the ground so fast it was almost military in its precision. "Good boy, now stay." Jake held up one hand. Buster remained perfectly motionless, every muscle tensed with controlled energy, eyes locked on the ball. "Now Vex, throw this as hard as you can in any direction." Vexthul accepted the ball, which seemed almost insultingly simple. "And then what? The creature will flee?" Jake grinned. "Just throw it." Vexthul hurled the ball with enough force to dent steel. It sailed through the air like a tiny missile, disappearing into the forest beyond. Before it had even reached the peak of its arc, Buster was gone, not running but flowing like liquid lightning through the underbrush, his golden form weaving between trees with impossible grace and speed. "How did he know where it would land?" Vexthul asked, genuinely impressed despite himself. "Physics, trajectory calculation, wind compensation," Jake said matter-of-factly. "Golden retrievers have been bred for over a century to be living ballistic computers. Plus, their sense of smell is about 10,000 times better than ours, so he can track that ball through scent trails that would be invisible to us." 2 minutes later, Buster emerged from the forest, the ball held gently in his mouth, despite the fact that it had to be traveling at near supersonic speeds when he caught it. He trotted back to Jake, dropped the ball at his feet, and sat again without being asked. "Roll over," Jake said. Buster rolled over. "Play dead." Buster flopped dramatically onto his side and lay perfectly still. "Shake hands." Buster sat up and extended his right paw, which Jake solemnly shook before turning to Vexthul. "Want to try?" Vexthul, feeling somewhat ridiculous, extended one crystalline claw toward Buster. The dog immediately placed his paw against it and held the position until Vexthul pulled away. "I don't understand," the alien said slowly. "This creature is clearly intelligent, obviously athletic, and apparently capable of complex reasoning. Why does it obey your commands so readily? What hold do you have over it?" Jake scratched Buster behind the ears, which produced a look of pure bliss on the dog's face. "No hold at all. He obeys because he wants to, because we're packmates, partners. But you're clearly the alpha. You give commands, he follows them." "Am I?" Jake pulled out another ball and threw it without warning. Buster streaked after it immediately. "Or is he training me to throw balls for him whenever he wants to play fetch?" Vexthul considered this as Buster returned, tail wagging so hard his entire back end wiggled. "Your species domesticated apex predators." "Wolves, yeah. About 15,000 years ago, give or take. Course, they domesticated us right back. We give them food, shelter, medical care, and endless entertainment. They give us loyalty, companionship, and unconditional love. Plus, they help us hunt, guard our homes, find lost people, detect diseases, and provide emotional support. You formed a symbiotic relationship with predators?" "Vex, we didn't just form relationships with predators." Jake gestured toward the forest around them. "We formed relationships with everything. Horses carry us places. Cattle provide milk and meat. Cats keep our grain stores free of rodents. Bees pollinate our crops. We've got partnerships with creatures on land, sea, and air." Buster had apparently decided that Vexthul needed the same ear-scratching treatment that Jake had provided. The dog stood on his hind legs, placed his front paws against the alien's crystalline chest, and began licking his face with enthusiastic determination. "But how?" Vexthul asked, trying to maintain his dignity while being thoroughly washed by a golden retriever. "How do you convince apex predators to become allies instead of enemies?" Jake's grin was the most genuinely happy expression Vexthul had seen on any sentient face. "Same way you make friends with anyone, Vex. You find out what they need, you figure out what you need, and you see if there's a way everybody wins." Buster had finished his impromptu grooming session and was now sitting at Vexthul's feet, tail still wagging, looking up at him with an expression of pure adoration. Without thinking, Vexthul reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. Buster's reaction was immediate and total. His eyes half closed in pleasure, and his tail somehow managed to wag even harder. For the first time in 3 centuries, Vexthul found himself smiling. That evening, as they sat around Jake's perfectly controlled campfire with Buster sprawled contentedly between them, Vexthul finally asked the question that had been eating at him for 3 days. "Human Jake," he began, absently scratching behind Buster's ears in the exact spot that made the dog's leg kick involuntarily. "I must know something. Your species appears soft, weak, fragile. You have no natural armor, no claws, no fangs, no venom, no ability to breathe fire or manipulate matter at the molecular level. By every measure my people use to determine evolutionary fitness, you should be prey animals, yet somehow you've become the dominant species on this entire planet." Jake poked at the fire with his stick, sending up another shower of sparks. "Well, when you put it like that, we do sound pretty pathetic." "So how?" Vexthul leaned forward, genuinely desperate to understand. "How did you survive long enough to develop technology? How did you overcome creatures that were bigger, stronger, faster, more naturally armed than you? What is your secret?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that Vexthul hadn't heard before. "You want to know what makes humans apex predators, Vex? It's not what we can do, it's what we won't stop doing." He pulled out a small device that Vexthul recognized as some kind of communication tool and began swiping through images. "See? Every other species on this planet has limits. A lion will chase prey for maybe a few hundred meters, then give up if it's too much work. A shark will attack if you're in its territory, but it won't follow you across oceans. Even the most persistent predators will eventually say, not worth it, and find easier prey." Jake showed him an image of humans running, not fleeing in terror, but running with methodical, steady persistence. "Humans? We don't do that. We don't have a not worth it setting. You see that guy in the picture? He's running 26 miles, for fun, because someone told him it was impossible to run that far, and humans have this weird thing where we hear impossible and think, challenge accepted." Buster lifted his head, apparently recognizing something in Jake's tone, and rested his chin on the human's knee in a gesture of support. "Our ancestors," Jake continued, "used to hunt mammoth. You know what a mammoth is, Vex. Picture an elephant, but bigger, hairier, and angrier. Now picture a group of humans with pointed sticks, deciding they want to eat one. Any sane species would take one look at a mammoth and think, well, I guess I'm vegetarian now. But humans didn't do that? Hell no. Humans looked at mammoths and thought, you know what? I bet if we poke that thing with sticks for long enough, eventually it'll get tired and fall over. And then they spent the next 12 hours chasing it across the frozen tundra, taking turns jabbing it with pointy sticks, until the mammoth literally died of exhaustion. Vexstool blinked. That sounds incredibly inefficient. Oh, it was terrible. Probably took all day, maybe longer. But here's the thing, it worked. And once humans figure out something works, we don't stop doing it. We do it better, faster, more efficiently, we make tools to do it easier, we teach our kids how to do it, we turn it into a science. Jake pulled up another image, this one showing some kind of primitive human dwelling. We didn't just survive the Ice Age, Vex, we thrived in it. While every other species was migrating to warmer climates, or hibernating or dying off, humans looked at a world covered in glacier ice and said, you know what this needs? More humans. But surely there were limits to this persistence, Vexstool protested. Surely there were challenges your species couldn't overcome through simple stubbornness. Jake's grin was back, but there was something almost predatory about it now. You'd think so, wouldn't you? Except we're sitting here having this conversation on a planet that humans have completely reshaped to suit our needs. We've got permanent settlements on every continent, including the ones that are frozen solid and the ones that are mostly desert. We've been to the deepest parts of our oceans and sent machines to other planets. We've eradicated diseases that killed millions, split the atom, and figured out how to make rocks think. Make rocks think? Computers, Vex. We taught sand to do math by hitting it with lightning in very specific patterns. Because someone said it was impossible, and you know how we feel about that word. Buster's tail thumped against the ground, apparently approving of this explanation. The thing about humans, Jake said, scratching the dog's head, is that we don't just adapt to our environment. We make our environment adapt to us. Cold? We make fire and build shelters. Hungry? We plant crops and domesticate animals. Predators? We make them into pets. Disease? We invent medicine. Distance? We build machines that go faster than anything nature ever made. But other species have intelligence, Vexstool pointed out. Other species use tools. Sure they do, but they use the same tools their ancestors used. A crow will use a stick to get insects out of a tree, just like crows have been doing for thousands of years. Humans? We went from pointed sticks to nuclear weapons in about 10,000 years. We're not just intelligent, Vex. We're relentlessly, obsessively innovative. Jake pulled out his phone again and showed Vexstool a picture of what appeared to be a massive structure made of metal and glass. This is the International Space Station. It's a permanent human settlement in orbit around our planet. We put it there because we wanted to see what was up there. And space is a deadly vacuum that will kill you instantly. Wasn't enough of a reason not to go. Your species built settlements in the void between worlds. Vex, we've got humans living permanently in Antarctica, which is basically a frozen wasteland where nothing should be able to survive. We've got cities and deserts where the temperature regularly exceeds 50 degrees Celsius. We've got settlements on islands that are regularly hit by hurricanes and valleys that flood every year, on mountains where the air is too thin to breathe properly. Jake gestured around them at the peaceful forest. This whole area? 100 years ago it was considered uninhabitable wilderness. Now it's a nature preserve that we maintain for recreational purposes. We didn't just conquer our environment, Vex. We conquered it so thoroughly that we can afford to set aside large chunks of it just because we think it's pretty. Vexstool sat in silence, processing this information. So when you say humans are apex predators, I mean, we're not just at the top of the food chain on this planet. We redesigned the entire food chain to suit our needs. We decide which species live and which ones die. We've brought species back from extinction because we felt bad about wiping them out. We've created new species through selective breeding. We've got animals that exist purely because we think they're cute. Buster lifted his head and gave Jake's face another enthusiastic licking. Case in point, Jake laughed. Buster here is the product of centuries of humans selectively breeding wolves to be the perfect companion. We literally redesigned apex predators to be our best friends. And the crazy part? They're happier for it. Domestic dogs live longer, healthier lives than their wild cousins. You improved upon evolution itself. Vex, we didn't just improve on evolution. We took over from it. Evolution is slow, random, inefficient. It takes millions of years to make small changes, and most of them don't work out. Humans? We can redesign an entire species in a few generations if we put our minds to it. The alien stared into the fire, his worldview crumbling and rebuilding itself with each revelation. My species defines apex predators as those with the greatest individual combat ability. And that makes sense from your perspective, Jake said kindly. But individual combat ability doesn't mean much when you're facing an entire species that refuses to give up, learns from every failure, and turns every challenge into an opportunity for innovation. You want to know what makes humans truly apex, Vex? It's not that we're the strongest or the fastest or the most heavily armed. Jake reached over and scratched behind Buster's ears again, the simple gesture somehow carrying profound meaning. It's that we never, ever, ever stop trying to figure out how to make things better. The rescue beacon that Vexthul had activated on his first day finally received a response on the morning of the fourth day. The familiar crystalline hum of Crystari technology filled the air as his species' signature cloaked transport materialized above the forest canopy. Within moments, a full extraction team had descended to his location, their armor gleaming with the same prismatic light that had once filled him with such pride. Commander Zeftar, Vexthul's immediate superior, surveyed the scene with obvious confusion. There was Vexthul, sitting calmly by a primitive combustion fire, apparently engaged in some kind of food-sharing ritual with a local human and what appeared to be a domesticated predator. This was not the scenario anyone had been expecting. Vexthul! Zeftar's voice carried the harmonic undertones that indicated barely controlled irritation. Explain why you have not secured this sector for our advanced scouts. Explain why you appear to be socializing with the indigenous population. Vexthul looked up at his commander, then at Jake, who was in the process of showing Buster how to high-five with his paw. The contrast was so stark it was almost painful. Here was everything he had once thought represented the pinnacle of evolution. Advanced technology, individual combat superiority, the ability to reshape matter at will. And there was Jake, accomplishing the impossible with nothing more than patience, ingenuity, and an inexplicable refusal to accept limitations. Commander, Vexthul began carefully. I have spent the last 4 days conducting a comprehensive analysis of this species' capabilities. My findings suggest that our initial assessment may have been incomplete. Incomplete how? Zeftar's claws extended slightly, a sure sign his patience was wearing thin. They are primitives, soft, weak, technologically inferior, perfect subjects for subjugation or elimination depending on our needs. Jake looked up at the sound of the word elimination, and Vexthul felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest. Over the past 4 days, he had grown genuinely fond of the strange human and his impossibly optimistic canine companion. The thought of either of them coming to harm was suddenly unacceptable. Perhaps, Vexthul said slowly, you should observe them before making that determination. What followed was the most educational 30 minutes in recent Crystari military history. Jake, apparently recognizing that this was some kind of test or demonstration, threw himself into the role with the same easy competence he had shown in everything else. When Zeftar questioned human technological capabilities, Jake pulled out his smartphone and casually explained that it contained more processing power than the computers that had landed humans on their moon decades earlier, that it could access the sum total of human knowledge from anywhere on the planet, and that most humans carried one as a matter of course. Your moon? Commander Rathkul, the team's tactical specialist, couldn't hide his surprise. You have achieved interplanetary travel? Oh, we went to the moon 50-some years ago, Jake said with a shrug. Been there 6 times, actually. These days we're more focused on Mars. Got a bunch of robots up there right now, driving around, taking pictures, looking for signs of life. We're hoping to send people there within the next decade or so. When the Crystari questioned human adaptability, Jake mentioned that humans currently lived in permanent settlements on every continent, in environments ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest, to high-altitude mountains, to underwater research stations. When they questioned human problem-solving abilities, Jake demonstrated his smartphone's GPS system, explained how humans had put a network of satellites in orbit to help people navigate, and mentioned that the same technology was used for everything from agriculture to disaster relief to finding lost pets. You have orbital infrastructure? This from Commander Velnex, the team's science officer. Couple thousand satellites, last I checked, Jake replied cheerfully. Plus the space station I mentioned to Vex. We use them for communication, navigation, weather prediction, scientific research, Earth observation, that sort of thing. Oh, and entertainment. Can't forget satellite TV. But it was when Zeftar made the mistake of suggesting that humans were clearly inferior due to their lack of natural weapons that Jake delivered the coup de grace. Natural weapons. Well, I guess that's one way to look at it. Jake reached into his backpack and pulled out what appeared to be a simple folding knife. This is what most humans carry for basic utility work. Cutting rope, opening packages, preparing food, that kind of thing. He opened the blade, which gleamed with an edge that looked suspiciously sharp. Made from an alloy of iron and carbon that we've been perfecting for about 3,000 years, the steel is harder than most natural materials, holds an edge better than obsidian, and can be resharpened indefinitely. Then Jake folded the knife away and pulled out his smartphone again. But if we're talking about actual weapons, he pulled up what appeared to be a technical schematic. This is a hydrogen bomb. One of these has the explosive power of about 50 million tons of TNT. We've built them with yields up to 100 megatons, which is roughly the equivalent of the meteor impact that killed the dinosaurs. The silence that followed was so complete that Vextool could hear Buster's tail wagging against the ground. You have weapons capable of planetary sterilization? Zeftar's voice had lost all traces of condescension. Well, yeah, Jake said, as if this were obvious. I mean, we try not to use them. Bad for the environment, you know? But we've got about 13,000 of them just in case, plus delivery systems that can put them anywhere on the planet in under 30 minutes. 13,000, give or take. The exact number's classified, but that's the general ballpark. Of course, that's just nuclear weapons. We've also got biological weapons, chemical weapons, kinetic weapons, directed energy weapons, cyber weapons. Jake paused thoughtfully. Actually, now that I think about it, humans have gotten really creative about finding new ways to break things when we need to. Commander Rakul stepped forward, his tactical implants obviously working overtime. If your species possesses such destructive capability, why have you not used it to expand beyond your homeworld? Why are you not conquering other star systems? Jake looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Why would we want to do that? To spread your dominion, to claim resources, to eliminate potential threats before they can challenge you. But we've got plenty of resources here, Jake said. I mean, sure, we're working on sustainable development and renewable energy and all that, but it's not like we're running out of stuff. And as for threats, he gestured vaguely at the Crystari team. Well, if someone shows up and wants to be friends, that's great. If they show up and want to cause trouble, we'll deal with it. But why go looking for fights? Because that is what apex predators do, Zeftar said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. They expand their territory, they eliminate competition, they dominate. Jake scratched behind Buster's ears, a gesture that had become automatic over the past few days. See, that's where I think you might have the wrong idea about what apex means. You're thinking about it like being the biggest, meanest fish in the pond. But what happens when you run out of pond? He stood up, brushing dirt off his ranger uniform. Humans figured out a long time ago that the real trick isn't being the scariest thing in your environment. It's making your environment work for you. We don't need to conquer other worlds because we've got this one running exactly the way we want it. We don't need to eliminate potential competitors because we've gotten really good at turning competitors into partners. Buster chose that moment to trot over to Commander Zeftar and sit politely at his feet, tail wagging hopefully. The massive Crystari warrior stared down at the dog with obvious bewilderment. He wants you to pet him, Jake explained. Fair warning, once you start, he's going to expect it every time he sees you. Almost involuntarily, Zeftar reached down and touched Buster's head. The dog's reaction was immediate and total. His entire body wiggled with joy, and he began making soft, contented sounds that somehow managed to be both utterly alien and completely universal. This creature was once an apex predator? Zeftar asked, his voice strangely quiet. His ancestors were, Jake confirmed. We've been partners for about 15,000 years now. Best decision both species ever made. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds were Buster's contented sighs and the gentle crackling of Jake's campfire. Finally, Vexthul broke the silence. Commander, I believe our intelligence on this species requires significant revision. Zeftar looked around at his team, all of whom were staring at Jake with expressions ranging from confusion to something approaching awe. Indeed. Perhaps we should reconsider our approach to first contact protocols. That would be wise, Vexthul agreed. Also, Commander, before we depart, I believe Human Jake has something called s'mores that he would like to share with the team. I highly recommend accepting his offer. Jake grinned and reached for his bag of marshmallows. Well, if you've got time, I'd be happy to show you folks how we really do campfire cooking. Fair warning, though, Once you try chocolate and marshmallow together, you're going to wonder how you lived without it. As the Kustari extraction team settled awkwardly around the humans' primitive campfire, Vexthul found himself smiling again. Perhaps Apex didn't mean what he had always thought it meant. Perhaps there was more than one way to be at the top of the food chain. And perhaps, just perhaps, the most dangerous predators in the galaxy were the ones who would rather make friends than enemies, but were absolutely, terrifyingly capable of either. Buster, apparently deciding that more aliens meant more potential sources of ear scratches, began making his rounds among the Kristari team. Within minutes, the galaxy's most feared warriors were taking turns throwing sticks for a golden retriever. Some battles, Vexthul reflected as he accepted another perfectly toasted marshmallow, were won not with claws and fire, but with patience, ingenuity, and an inexplicable ability to make even the most unlikely creatures feel welcome around a campfire. Humans, he was beginning to understand, had mastered the most dangerous weapon of all, friendship, and they'd deployed it with ruthless efficiency.